The studio was buzzing with anticipation as the live political panel kicked off. Seated under the bright studio lights were two very different voices in American politics: Karoline Leavitt, a sharp-tongued conservative firebrand known for her unapologetic style, and Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General with a reputation for staying composed even in the heat of battle. The moderator introduced the night's topic: election integrity and the future of political discourse. But the moment Karoline began to speak, it was clear this wouldn't be a calm discussion. "I'm tired of career politicians like Pam pretending they care about the American people," Karoline snapped, her voice edged with disdain. "People like her have sat in power for years while the country crumbled. And let's not forget, Pam, your cozy ties with lobbyists and corporate elites." Pam raised her eyebrows slightly but said nothing. Karoline wasn't done. "Honestly, Pam, people like you are the reason voters don't trust anyone anymore. It's all hairspray and sound bites, but when it comes to standing for truth, you've been missing in action." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Even the moderator looked stunned by how personal the attack had become. All eyes turned to Pam Bondi. Would she strike back? Would she fold? Or would she do something no one expected? Pam Bondi remained silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. The studio lights caught a flicker in her eyes, not anger, but something cooler. Focused. Calculated. She gently set down her pen, adjusted her mic, and leaned in just slightly toward Karoline, not breaking eye contact. "You know," Pam began, her voice calm and measured, "it's always interesting when someone young in the game thinks that loud insults can replace experience." The room instantly quieted, everyone knew a moment was coming. "I've spent my career prosecuting criminals, standing up for victims, and taking on corporate giants when no one else would. I didn't do that for a camera or a Twitter clip. I did it while people like you were still figuring out how to spell public service." Karoline shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering just a bit. Pam continued, her tone firm but never raised. "You can attack my appearance, my resume, and even twist the facts, but that doesn't make you right. That just makes you loud. And the American people deserve more than noise." The audience was dead silent. Even the moderator didn't move to interrupt. Pam leaned back in her chair, her point made, not with fury, but with force. Karoline blinked, clearly not expecting restraint to carry so much power. The silence in the studio lingered like a heavy fog, stretching longer than anyone expected. The control room held its breath, unsure whether to cut to commercial. But Pam Bondi wasn't finished. She leaned slightly forward again, her voice low but commanding, calm, yet impossible to ignore. "You know, Karoline," she said, "there's something incredibly dangerous about turning every political disagreement into a personal insult. It's not just rude, it's reckless. Because when you reduce everything to attacks and sound bites, you stop listening. You stop learning. And worst of all, you stop leading." Pam glanced at the camera, then back at Karoline. "I've sat across from cartel bosses, white-collar criminals, and con artists who lied to protect themselves. But I've also sat with grieving mothers, survivors, and whistleblowers who wanted nothing more than justice. And do you know what they all had in common? They didn't care about headlines, they cared about results. About who showed up. Who stood their ground when no one was watching." Karoline swallowed hard, her posture stiffening. Pam didn't raise her voice once, but somehow, every word felt louder than Karoline's earlier jabs. "Politics isn't about proving you're the loudest person in the room," Pam said. "It's about proving you care enough to listen. Even to those who disagree with you." She paused. Her eyes locked onto Karoline's. "And right now? All I hear is a young woman trying very hard to be noticed, not to be understood." The audience murmured, a mix of surprise and admiration rippling through the crowd. Some nodded. Others sat stunned. Pam finished quietly, "You don't build trust by tearing down people you've never taken the time to know." She folded her hands, her point fully delivered. Karoline opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again. No rebuttal came. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to say. The moderator, sensing the shift in the room, finally cleared his throat and tried to regain control. "Thank you, Attorney General Bondi," he said, his voice a bit shakier than before. "Ms. Leavitt, would you like to respond?" Karoline adjusted her blazer, her usual fire noticeably dimmed. She forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well," she began, chuckling lightly, "I guess I hit a nerve." But it fell flat. There was no laughter from the audience. No cheers from her usual base in the crowd. Just an awkward silence that confirmed what everyone was beginning to realize: this wasn't a debate anymore. It was a lesson. Pam didn't flinch. She simply looked back at Karoline, her expression neutral. The power dynamic had completely flipped, and everyone in the room knew it. Even those who had come in rooting for Karoline were now re-evaluating what they just witnessed. Online, the moment was already exploding. Clips of Pam's poised takedown were spreading like wildfire on social media. Phrases like, "class over chaos," "Bondi stays unbothered," and "Karoline gets humbled" were trending within minutes. Commentators across the spectrum chimed in. On one conservative blog, a writer admitted, "I don't always agree with Bondi, but tonight she reminded us what maturity in politics looks like." A progressive commentator on YouTube reacted live, "Karoline tried to go low, and Pam took her to school, without ever raising her voice. That's real power." Back in the studio, Karoline tried to steer the conversation back to policy, but the damage was done. Her personal attack had backfired. Her opponent didn't yell, didn't insult, she simply responded with presence, and that silenced the room louder than any shout ever could. The moderator tried to salvage the discussion, but the tension lingered. What was supposed to be a heated political argument had turned into something much more memorable, a public demonstration of what real leadership under pressure looks like. As the segment wrapped and the credits rolled, the studio lights dimmed slightly, and the host thanked the panelists. Karoline Leavitt quickly unhooked her mic, her jaw tight, eyes fixed ahead as she made a beeline toward the hallway exit. Her aides trailed behind her silently, none of them dared speak first. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi stayed behind, exchanging polite nods with the production crew and even cracking a small smile at the floor manager. She didn't gloat. She didn't mention what just happened. She didn't need to. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but the story had already taken on a life of its own. Within the hour, clips of the exchange flooded X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. The contrast between Karoline's aggressive, almost theatrical attacks and Pam's composed, razor-sharp response became a viral moment across political lines. Fox News pundits debated whether Karoline had gone too far too fast. MSNBC analysts praised Bondi's restraint and called the moment a textbook example of political maturity. Even independent creators who rarely agreed with either woman were calling it a masterclass. One viral post read, "Karoline came swinging like she was at a campaign rally. Pam replied like she was at a courtroom bench. Guess who won?" Another user posted a split screen, Karoline mid-rant, Pam calmly listening with the caption, "Experience doesn't yell. It waits for the right moment." Even political rivals of Bondi acknowledged the skill. A progressive congresswoman tweeted, "We disagree on almost everything. But tonight, Pam Bondi showed the power of not taking the bait." Some even speculated that the moment could impact Karoline's rising star status in the party. While her supporters remained loyal, others began to question whether she was truly ready for the national stage, or just good at starting fights she couldn't finish. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi quietly left the studio and slid into the back seat of a black SUV waiting outside. Her aide turned to her, phone in hand. "It's everywhere," she said. "They're calling it the moment that shut down the shouting match." Pam just looked out the window and smiled slightly. "I didn't shut anything down," she replied. "I just reminded them that words mean more when you don't waste them." Days after the debate, the exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Pam Bondi continued to reverberate through political circles and media outlets. What could have been just another fiery panel had transformed into something far more significant, a defining moment not only for both women, but for the broader tone of political discourse. Cable news roundtables dissected every frame. Pam's body language. Karoline's miscalculation. The moment the audience shifted. Political commentators replayed the clip on loop. Bondi's words, "You don't build trust by tearing down people you've never taken the time to know," had struck a nerve with people exhausted by political theatrics. Polls taken that week revealed an interesting twist. Bondi's favorability, even among younger voters and independents, had ticked upward. Not necessarily because of her politics, but because of how she handled pressure. Karoline, meanwhile, tried to move forward, scheduling a series of interviews to clarify her remarks. But each one felt like damage control. Her usual confident delivery now came off as defensive. The confrontation had exposed a weakness, not of ideology, but of temperament. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, stayed quiet. She didn't tweet about the moment. She didn't do a victory lap on talk shows. She simply returned to her usual schedule, letting others do the talking. And they did. A Sunday editorial in The Hill put it simply, in an age where political ambition often rewards volume over value, Pam Bondi reminded the country that silence, when used wisely, speaks louder than outrage. Weeks later, students in political science classrooms were shown the clip as an example of rhetorical control. Leadership coaches referenced it in seminars. Even some Republican strategists began rethinking how they prepared young candidates for live TV. For Pam, the moment wasn't about humiliation, it was about elevation. She showed that poise is power. That leadership doesn't require yelling. And that in a room full of shouting voices, the one that stays calm often commands the most attention. As for Karoline Leavitt, the lesson was clear: in politics, going personal may get you noticed, but if you aim at someone with real presence and miss, the silence that follows can be deafening. Weeks after the broadcast, the incident still lingered in the political consciousness, not just as a clash of personalities, but as a symbolic confrontation between two generations of conservatism. Karoline Leavitt, once heralded as the bold new voice of her movement, found herself reassessing her strategy. Her team, once thrilled by her raw and unfiltered energy, now quietly admitted the Bondi exchange had been a misstep. Behind closed doors, donors expressed concern, not about her passion, but her discipline. She issued a carefully worded op-ed in a right-leaning publication, attempting to reposition the moment. "I challenge the establishment, and I'll keep doing it. But I also recognize the value of listening, especially to those who came before me." It was an attempt at humility, but to many, it read as a quiet admission of defeat. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi returned to the political spotlight with renewed credibility. While she hadn't planned for that moment to be a turning point, it elevated her status overnight. She was invited to speak on civility in politics, integrity in leadership, and even gave a talk at a law school titled "Holding Ground Without Losing Grace." And although she never publicly referenced the incident again, the ripple effects were clear. Veteran politicians praised her handling of the moment as a rare blend of strength and restraint. Even opponents who disagreed with her policy positions acknowledged the discipline she showed. Across the country, the exchange was reframed as more than a viral TV moment. It became a case study in what voters, especially younger and undecided ones, were hungry for: not just authenticity, but maturity. Not just strength, but wisdom. In the end, Karoline Leavitt's mistake wasn't going after Pam Bondi. It was underestimating her. And Pam didn't silence the room with force. She silenced it with something much harder to master: respect. Months later, long after the headlines faded, the effects of that single televised exchange continued to unfold behind the scenes. Karoline Leavitt, though still active on the circuit, had noticeably changed her tone. Her speeches remained passionate, but they were less combative, more thought out, less reactive. Political observers noted she had adopted a controlled fire, clearly shaped by the backlash she received. Some speculated that if she had any long-term ambitions, especially national ones, she had learned her lesson the hard way. She never brought up Pam Bondi again publicly. But insiders said the moment had been a turning point in her career development, one that stung deeply, but forced growth. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi's influence quietly expanded. Without seeking a spotlight, she was now being tapped to mentor rising conservative candidates, not to train them in how to fight, but how to lead. "Power isn't in your volume," she told one group privately. "It's in your conviction and your control." In bipartisan spaces, even moderates and some liberal voices referenced the Bondi moment when discussing political decorum. It became a cultural reference point, like a mic drop that didn't need a mic. One political journalist wrote, "Pam Bondi reminded us that elegance in politics is not weakness, it's a weapon of its own." Later that year, she was asked to speak at a national leadership summit. When she stepped on stage, the crowd rose, not out of hype, but out of respect. And as she looked across the audience, filled with young leaders, seasoned lawmakers, and skeptics alike, she opened with a single sentence that would be quoted for years to come: "Sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that refuses to shout." With that, Pam Bondi didn't just win a moment. She left behind a standard. Back in Washington, D.C., the legacy of the exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Pam Bondi began to ripple through more than just media narratives. It started influencing how power was perceived on Capitol Hill. Congressional aides, especially those working for younger, more aggressive members of both parties, began referencing the incident internally. It was quietly dubbed the Bondi Principle, the idea that authority wasn't proven by volume, but by how one handled confrontation under pressure. At a private roundtable with Republican strategists, one advisor remarked, "We're seeing that swing voters, especially women, are responding more to composure than combat." That Bondi moment, whether people liked her or not, cut through the noise. Even some Democrats who fiercely opposed her policies mentioned her name with reluctant respect. One senator reportedly told colleagues, "We need more people in Congress like her. Not politically, just in terms of tone." Meanwhile, a few up-and-coming Republican women who had once modeled their public persona after Leavitt's brash style began to rework their media training. On-camera drills started including exercises like, "What would Bondi do?" A reference to staying cool when provoked, delivering a blow without making it personal, and letting silence work in your favor. Pam Bondi never acknowledged this shift. She continued her work behind the scenes, declining several high-profile interview requests, telling one producer, "The moment spoke for itself. I don't need to keep repeating it." And that restraint only made her message louder. Months later, a young congressional candidate being interviewed on a political podcast was asked who her political role model was. She smiled and said, "I used to think it was whoever shouted the loudest. But then I saw Pam Bondi take down a personal attack with nothing but discipline. That's when I realized, real influence doesn't need to yell." Thus, the moment didn't just end in the studio that night. It lived on, in how future leaders spoke, in how campaigns were run, and in how voters began to notice the difference between those who wanted attention and those who had earned it. A full year had passed since the televised confrontation between Karoline Leavitt and Pam Bondi. What had started as a heated debate transformed into something far more enduring. The moment was now etched into the broader political memory, not for its drama, but for what it revealed about the public's appetite for something long considered old-fashioned: grace. The confrontation had become a case study at media institutions like Columbia Journalism School and Georgetown's Political Communication program. Professors referred to it as the silence that spoke, showing frame-by-frame breakdowns of how Bondi's steady delivery and restraint shifted power without ever raising her voice. Political campaigns, especially among women, began to pivot. Instead of pushing candidates toward theatrics, strategists started emphasizing tone, posture, and emotional intelligence. A new phrase quietly spread through conservative consulting firms: "Be Bondi when it counts." For Karoline Leavitt, the road forward was bumpier. Though she retained her base and rebuilt some political capital, she never fully shook the shadow of the viral exchange. Every time she appeared on television, comment sections still referenced it. Hope she learned from the Bondi lesson. This time, don't go personal unless you're ready for classy fire. To her credit, Karoline evolved. Her interviews grew more tempered. Her social media posts, once filled with jabs, now included policy explanations and voter engagement. She privately admitted to colleagues that the moment humbled her, and forced her to reflect on the line between boldness and belligerence. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi's role had shifted subtly, but powerfully. She didn't run for office again. She didn't chase the spotlight. But she became a sought-after mentor, by both rising Republican candidates and, surprisingly, a few across the aisle. She was invited to give closed-door talks on leadership and communication, not about winning arguments, but mastering moments. In one private session at a bipartisan summit, she stood before a room of future lawmakers and said, "Politics will always be noisy. The question is, will you add to the noise, or will you command silence when it matters most?" Those words, recorded secretly by a staffer, spread across the internet again. And just like before, it wasn't rage or controversy that made people listen, it was clarity. The American public, weary of years filled with shouting matches and finger-pointing, began showing subtle signs of change. Viral moments still came and went, but the ones that stuck were the ones grounded in composure. Young voters, once drawn to spectacle, began voicing support for leaders who could debate with sharpness and dignity. Voter focus groups revealed that trust was increasingly tied to tone, not just talking points. Even in primetime television panels, moderators began intervening less when discussions turned heated. Why? Because audiences wanted to see who could hold the moment, without breaking. The Leavitt-Bondi moment became a metaphor. For politics. For media. For leadership. It showed that power wasn't just about being right, it was about how you stood when challenged, and how you responded when pushed. Pam Bondi never released a book. Never gave a TED Talk. Never monetized the moment. She simply continued doing what she had always done, serving, advising, and leading with calm precision. But if you walked the halls of political leadership programs in D.C., or the green rooms of major news studios, you'd often hear her name when things got heated. Channel your inner Bondi. And in that quiet, she left her mark, without a campaign. Without a headline. Without needing to shout. Just with presence.